Probably one of the most recognizable structures in all of mankind. It's seen 2,000 years of history, bloodshed, violence, death, shows of skill, power, strength, and bravery. It was even made into a castle. Welcome to the Colosseum. If you are new here, please hit that subscribe button. If you're a recurring viewer, welcome back. Hit that like button, comment. It means more than you know. Let's get into this. The Colosseum is perhaps the single most famous monument that we can see of ancient Rome today. It's still the largest amphitheater in the world despite its age. Strangely enough, the Colosseum actually started as an artificial lake, which was built in the palace of one of the world's most hated men, Emperor Nero. When Nero died, his successor Vespasian decided to give that lake to the people of Rome to say sorry for Nero's rule. And Vespasian was the first Flavian emperor, and he decided to start building the amphitheater in 72 AD on that area. He used 100,000 slaves, and it took 8 years to build this massive amphitheater. What we know as the Colosseum today was actually called the Flavian Amphitheater. So why the name change? Well, this area was a place of games and spectacles and monuments and statues, and there was one giant statue called Sol, god of the sun, or sun god. And this statue was enormous, apparently 100 foot tall, and was built by Nero. So, one of my favorite Roman emperors, Hadrian, he's the guy that built that long big wall, and the Castello San Angelo and the Pantheon, etc., etc. He decided to remove this statue in the early Middle Ages, and when he did, the Colosseum got its name. In its heyday, the Colosseum would be able to hold 80,000 people, and it's regularly had crowds of up to 65,000 people coming and watching these games. Now, with all these people in the Colosseum, you would need to know where you would go and sit. So you would go through one of these 80 archways, which were all numbered, and you would follow the tunnels, steps, and whatever to your specific seats. It's vital that you sat in your seat because Rome, like most ancient civilizations, had a class system. If you were a magistrate or a priest or a part of the imperial family, you'd be right at the bottom of the Colosseum, closest to their action. Now, I know what you're thinking. If you've ever seen the Gladiator movie, you'll be familiar with Maximus, played by Russell Crowe, who attempts to harm this class of people in the seating area. But that wouldn't have been allowed to happen because they were protected by a netting, which would block any attempts on their lives or assaults from above crowds. If you were lucky to wear a toga, you would be part of the Senate, and you would be seated above the imperial family, still very, very close to the action. If you were also lucky and you were a businessman, you could buy seats above the Senate. So your view was quite good, but not as good as the imperial family or the Senate's. The next class sat even higher still, the plebeians. That's where we get the name plebs from. That's the common people like you and I. They were sitting pretty high up. They wouldn't have a great view, but they would still be allowed to go watch the games. The final sector would be the foreigners and enslaved. And, well, Rome, like all ancient civilizations, was sexist. And so the women would be sitting there as well. They would be sitting on wooden bars, and your view would be quite terrible indeed from all the way up there. But if you were part of a different class, you wouldn't be seen dead up there because you would get in for free if you were sitting in the top sector. But you wanted to sit with your class. Now we know who sits where. What would they be watching? Well, there'd be 3 games that they would be watching. In the morning, you would have the animal hunts. You see, the Romans would go to places like Asia, the rest of Europe and Africa, and get lions, bears, tigers, etc., and hunt them for sport, displaying whatever hunting skills they have to the public. After the hunting, there would be lunchtime, so while you are eating your fish or bread or whatever you were eating at the time, the Romans thought you might need some entertainment, so that's when they decided to execute people. In the afternoon, you would be welcomed to the finale, the gladiators. Now, let's get something straight. These gladiators were slaves, but they weren't your run-of-the-mill slaves. The gladiators were prized possessions. You see, gladiators were part of business. If you were a wealthy Roman, you may have a gladiator school, known as a ludus or ludus magnus, and you would have your slaves trained to become lean, mean fighting machines. You would help them find glory on the main stage and be paid for their possible deaths. You would also bet on your own gladiator to make more money. Now, because of this, gladiators were well fed, treated relatively well, even though they were slaves still. They were well trained, and they cost a lot of money to buy. Now, if you were a wealthy businessman, you didn't want to lose your investments. So, a lot of these bouts were not to the death, but to first blood, or adjudicated by a panel of judges to see who would win. That being said, there were a lot of bouts to the death, and it was often the first-timers, the new gladiators, that hadn't been trained or hadn't been given the correct equipment, which would be to the death, have battles to the death, because, of course, they were just slaves, and you hadn't invested anything in them, so there was nothing to lose. If you were lucky enough to get through these bouts, these first bouts, you might be able to become famous, draw a crowd, and with crowds came fame, freedom, and money. Rome, for all its achievements as an ancient society, was still exactly that, an ancient society. It's completely different to the society that we have today. They would have men fighting men, women fighting women, dwarfs fighting dwarfs. There were even amazing demonstrations of Roman battles that took place. On a number of occasions, famously, the amphitheatre was filled with water, flooded with water, and naval battles were demonstrated to the Roman public to show everyone how strong their empire was. If you look at the platform where the gladiatorial games took place, there's a number of trapdoors that would lead to elevators going up and down, which were pulled by slaves. But what was beneath these elevators was quite intense. See, there was a whole lot of cells where the gladiators and slaves would be kept. You were ill-trained, had poor equipment, and understanding that possible death was imminent. Constantine the Great decided to end the gladiatorial games in 325 AD, saying that they had no place in a time of civil and domestic peace. However, there were reports of gladiatorial games still going on all the way until 404 AD, when a monk, Saint Telemachus, decided to stop proceedings. Ironically, he was stoned to death. However, the Colosseum was still used for its animal hunts and mock battles, demonstrating all of the skill of the Roman army, all the way until 523, when it eventually stopped because of the costs involved. By the late 6th century, a small chapel had been built onto the amphitheatre within it, and it was converted to become a workshop and housing as well. There's also records of it being rented out all the way until the 12th century, and around the year 1200, a family took the Colosseum and fortified it into a castle. In 1349, nearly 1,200 years after the Colosseum had been built, it was damaged by an earthquake. I guess that's what happens when you build a giant building on an artificial lake. The stone that was lost during this earthquake was then used to rebuild hospitals, palaces, and even churches throughout Rome. More of its decorative superficial facade was then looted, and throughout the years, the Colosseum went into decline. In the 13th to the 16th century, during the Renaissance, the church took control over the Colosseum, and Pope Sixtus V planned to use the building as a wool factory to provide employment for Rome's women. This proposal fell through because of Pope Sixtus' death. Unsure of what to do with the Colosseum, in 1672, a cardinal decided to authorize bullfights after the successes of the bullfights in Spain. Thankfully, due to the public uproar, this idea was quickly shut down. It then became the home of religious order, and for the next 300 years, it was a place of worship. They had erected the Stations of the Cross, but it went into disrepair. There was vegetation growing inside the Colosseum and on top of it as well. By the 1930s, the dictator of Italy, Luce, Benito Mussolini, allowed archaeologists to finally finish their work that they had started previously in excavating the Colosseum and the surrounding areas, leaving us with the most amazing history. This grand ruin is what is left from a place of death and violence. But the fact that it is a ruin allows us as modern people to see the Roman Empire's decline, because it did decline, it's no longer here. But the very size of the Roman ruin suggests the size of its empire, because when it was an entity, it was one of the most powerful and largest and prolific empires the world has ever known. Thank you very much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. The more you know.